So friends, far and near, I understand as far away as South Africa, it is a great, great pleasure to bid you all welcome. I hope, and indeed I confidently expect, that you will be richly rewarded for sparing this hour out of your precious screen-free time to join UCD's Asia Pacific Research Network. Céad míle míle fáilte romh go léir. I'd just like to begin by thanking the voice in the background, which is that of my colleague Hugo O'Donnell, and also my colleague Naunori Kodate for all their work on bringing together this event. Like myself, Hugo and Now belong to UCD's Asia Pacific Research Network, and I'm just going to take a little bit of time to explain what the network is. The network is still only 3 years old and is thus, relatively speaking, still a newborn. It's essentially a consciousness-raising forum in UCD. But speaking for myself, I can say that it has already proved to be a lifeline for those of us who are true believers in the promise of the university. The 21st has been widely hailed as the Asian century. And yet UCD is, like many universities, I imagine, though perhaps a little bit more than some, struggling to take the full measure of this enormous gravitational shift in the world. Our network aims to act as a lever in this struggle, mainly by supporting our researchers and their work. This means essentially enhancing the connectivity and the visibility of Asia-based research, both within and beyond UCD and Ireland. Most of all, we in the Asia Pacific Research Network in UCD are trying to use our critical mass to advocate for the future provision of gold standard specialist BA degree programs in Asia studies, most especially in Asian languages and cultures. Chucky or law. Given the aspirations of UCD's network, Laurence Cox has to be the ideal speaker. His work on the hidden depths of Ireland's interface with Asia just hits all the right spots acutely. Laurence's work essentially belongs in, I suppose, 2 fields or maybe 3 fields. Social movements, so movements from below, from the grassroots, and then the academic study of religion, particularly Buddhism, but also of the huge cultural and social connectivity that Buddhism furthers. I think the only way of giving you a flavor of Laurence's work is probably just to read out the titles of his books. I just think that will really situate the importance of this, well, I regard Laurence as a national treasure. So I'm just going to read out the titles of some of the books. Why Social Movements Matter. We Make Our Own History, Marxism, Social Movements and the Twilight of Neoliberalism. Voices of 1968, Documents from the Global North. Understanding European Movements. New Social Movements, Global Justice Struggles, Anti-Austerity Protest. Marxism and Social Movements. Silence Would Be Treason, The Last Writings of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Buddhism and Ireland, From the Celts to the Counterculture and Beyond. Ireland's New Religious Movements. A Buddhist Crossroads. Pioneer Western Buddhists and Asian Networks, 1860 to 1960. Some of these books are edited books and some of them are collaborations. The latest is one such collaboration with Professor Alicia Turner of York University, Toronto, and Professor Brian Bocking of a parish closer to home, of UCC Cork. And the title of that work, part of the Dhammaloka project, The Irish Buddhist, the Forgotten Monk Who Faced Down the British Empire. So Laurence's work If Laurence is a national treasure, his work is a lifeline in my view. And I'm absolutely delighted to be, and I feel really privileged to be associated with this talk, to be the accidental chair of this talk on Asia through Irish eyes, an Irish Buddhist hobo in Myanmar. Laurence.
Thank you very much. And thanks a lot to everybody who's come. I can't possibly hope to live up to that, so I just have to apologize in advance. But I am going to try and tell a story or two and to draw some bigger threads out from it. So I'm going to be talking about this character mostly. As Mary said, this is Dhammaloka, born probably Laurence Carroll in Butlerstown around 1856. Here we see him ordained as a Buddhist monk in Rangoon around late 1901, early 1902. In between, he had left school around the age of 12, worked his way across the Atlantic, sailed up and down the east coast of the US, being a hobo, a migrant worker across the States, a docker in San Francisco, a sailor again on the San Francisco-Yokohama routes, and one way or another washed up in Rangoon. That little sketch misses out quite a bit, as his story did when he told it. In particular, there's 25 years suspiciously missing from what we can piece together. And the fact that he had at least 5 aliases probably has something to do with that. So I'll tell you a couple of stories about Dhammaloka, but also how they help us to think about what Ireland knew about Asia in his day and how we might engage with knowledge about Asia today. So we'll start here, the Chief Court of Burma in 1911. So this is 110 years ago, pretty much to the month. And this is very close to Ceylon Pagoda, which you might have seen in the news recently. And in the Chief Court, there were 2 pairs of Irish eyes staring across at each other. One of them, Dhammaloka's, as you've seen, in Buddhist robes, shaven head, bare feet, a hobo become a Buddhist monk. The other of them, Justice Daniel Toomey from Carrigtwohill in County Cork, a leading colonial judge, educated by the Jesuits, and then at the Middle Temple in London. And Dhammaloka is on trial for sedition, if you can see on the right, literally Dhammaloka versus emperor. So the 2 roles that these 2 Irish people take up in Rangoon in 1911 represent 2 very different Irish diaspora journeys through empire. Why is Dhammaloka on trial for sedition? Well, the British Empire has obviously arrived in Burma with a bang at the point of a bayonet. And what was often presented as a peaceful, serene, timeless Buddhist culture has actually transformed itself quite rapidly in the face of colonialism. So in the center here is a colored postcard of the day showing monks, much like Dhammaloka, heading out for their alms round as they had done every morning since the time of the Buddha, but on a Rangoon tram. To left and right, some of Dhammaloka's tracts, published at the printing press of a local English language newspaper, distributed through the postal system, through the railways, as part of a very modern conflict over religion and empire. So What's that conflict? Dhammaloka is a celebrity preacher. He's a polemicist. He's a publisher. In the middle here, you have a journalist talking about his speeches as Buddhism cum shillelagh. I'm not going to try to reproduce the stage Irish of this American journalist. A very contentious figure. You get a slightly less serene sense of him there on the left, but very much immensely, immensely popular among Burmese Buddhists. So that cartoon in which, or not really cartoon, but sketch, artist's impression, in which he looks a little bit like Dracula to me, walking on the hair of Hollywood flappers, is meant to represent a traditional Burmese Buddhist ritual of reverence, in which women lay their hair down for particularly revered monks to walk on. He's that kind of figure. He is a rock star. People travel for days to see him. Crowds of thousands come. They perform these sort of rituals of reverence. And that makes him something of a lightning rod, when what he does in his speeches is to challenge Christian missionaries. And when he does so across Asia. So here's a map of some of his major Asian engagements. You can see on the right there, Tokyo. In the very bottom right, Thursday Island in the Torres Straits, just above Australia. And then Hong Kong, Singapore, the Federated Malay States, Bangkok, all across Burma, Chittagong in today's Bangladesh, Calcutta, Ceylon, today's Sri Lanka, possibly also Nepal, Cambodia, we're not sure. And wherever he went, he challenges Christian missionaries in his persona as a Buddhist monk, and does so as a proxy for empire. In fact, one of his commonest slogans is to say, in effect, they will come for you with the Bible. They will come for you with the whiskey bottle. They will come for you with the Gatling gun. So missionary Christianity, cultural destruction in traditionally non-drinking countries, and military conquest, the three elements of colonialism. And when you say this kind of thing, it makes you somewhat popular. So let's come back to the courthouse and put it in context, because this is one of the days when the little streets are hurled upon the great. There on the right, beside Sule Pagoda Road, is the chief court. But surrounding the court, in January 1911, there is a huge crowd. So Burmese Buddhist monks, of course, have turned up, not least from his own monastery over there on the top left. But the cinema, the new cinema, which is just beside his monastery, has donated 2 days of its takings to his defense fund. Burmese Buddhist laity from all over, they've shut down the bazaar. They are bringing him in procession, in triumph, in a carriage, as you would a member of the deposed royal family. Chinatown's bazaar, which also runs right by his monastery, has shut down. And so has the Indian bazaar in the center, the Surati bazaar, because Rangoon in 1911 is more than 55% non-Burmese, largely Indian, Muslim, and Tamil dock workers and other migrant laborers. And organizing some of these Indians is Mohandas Gandhi's patron and a close collaborator, Pranjivan Mehta, whose newspaper, United Burma, is rated by British intelligence as deeply seditious and is very much waving the flag for Dhammaloka. So there is a multi-ethnic and indeed multi-religious crowd outside the court supporting Dhammaloka at his trial for sedition. And here, this is Rangoon Harbour at the same time. You can get a sense of the sort of plebeian cosmopolitanism that underlies that. So this is a world of many different ethnicities, working, interacting, trading in close proximity, many different levels of modernity. There's the new paddle steamer. There are the last of the high-speed sailing ships. Here are all sorts of different native crafts, and so on. And when these little streets and little boats surround the court, the empire actually blinks. The first thing they do is defer the trial. They go, we cannot possibly put this guy on trial right now. And then after the trial, they defer sentence. And then when they do sentence him, they give him the lightest possible slap on the wrist, because they cannot be seen to back down, of course. But they also can't make a martyr of him. So there's Dhammaloka on trial for sedition. But I want to step back a little bit and reflect on this, because in some ways, it strikes me that his gesture is a very Irish one. In Ireland, as in Burma, there is a dominant religion associated with the colonial power, and there is a religion which is that of the majority of the colonized population. And this creates a double bind for a 19th century empire, because on the one hand, empire cannot be seen to stomp too brutally on native religion. That doesn't work. By the late 19th, early 20th century, it's unacceptable. On the other hand, everybody knows that a challenge to the dominant religion, be it the Church of Ireland or missionary Christianity, is also political. And in a space like that, somebody like Dhammaloka, who as a Buddhist monk has every right, at least in theory, in legal theory, to defend Buddhism and to engage in the kind of religious polemics that people engage in these days, he can play there. So that's Dhammaloka's Irish gesture. But his opponent, Judge Daniel Toomey, I'd like to come back to him, because he's also engaging in a very Irish gesture. Remember, he is a kind of castle Catholic. He's Jesuit educated, trained then at the London Bar. And in fact, one of his big contributions by this stage is a theory of how British colonial law should interface with Buddhist monastic law. In the same period, of course, as the British Crown in Ireland is increasingly devolving functions like education and health and so on to the various churches, in practice, of course, primarily to the Catholic Church. So both Dhammaloka and Toomey, in their own ways, are looking at Burma through Irish eyes. And this is what I want to talk about a little bit now. But many of you will have seen this. It appears at the end of Ulysses in Molly Bloom's soliloquy as that Indian god in the museum in Kildare Street, a bigger religion than the Jews and our lords, both put together all over Asia. And for many years, when you went into the National Museum, this was the first thing you saw, with a plaque with this text on the left, that it was a trophy of Britain's newest colony, exhibited to the people of her oldest. And Colonel Sir Charles Fitzgerald, who donated it, felt absolutely no shame in making that analogy and didn't feel that it would be a source for critique, because, of course, both Burma and Ireland, in their own ways, were colonized. So that constructed what you can call imperial circuits of knowledge, ways of knowing, ways of thinking about the world, in which what was said in Ireland about Burma or in Burma about Ireland was mediated through this relationship with colonialism. And in that book that Mary kindly mentioned, Buddhism in Ireland, I looked at some of these circuits. So every time from the Alexandrian encounter back in the 4th century BCE to the present, there have been different kinds of relationship between Asia and Ireland, which have constructed different kinds of transmission of knowledge, different sorts of reception history. In this high imperial period, there are Irish members of the British military and the imperial service class, like Colonel Sir Charles Fitzgerald and Judge Daniel Toomey. There are exhibitions, there are museums, there are artworks, universities and libraries, Protestant missionaries. I grouped those together because then there is a separate Catholic circuit of knowledge as Ireland's Catholic spiritual empire ramps up in Asia and is disseminated back home. In newspapers, cinemas, racehorses, and songs, all sorts of information is disseminated. So that picture on the right there, these are Tibetan Buddhist dancing lamas, quote unquote, on the roof of Independent House in Abbey Street in 1924, brought there as part of the movie about the Mallory expedition to Everest. And then actual migration. So all of these things are going on. It's not an exaggeration, I think, to say that in 1890, ordinary Irish people knew rather more about Asia than they did in 1990. Probably also true in universities. I wouldn't make that claim for 1921 and 2021, but there is a definite slump in what Ireland knew about Asia and indeed what Asia knew about Ireland in the mid-20th century. So some of you will recognize some of what I've talked about, apologies, as coming out of discourses on Irish Orientalism or Kaori Nagai's great book, Empire of Analogies. Because these analogies were also systematically taught, for example, in training for the Indian civil service. They were taught not only in relation to language or law, but also to religion. And they appeared in many, many different forms. So here, for example, is Dr. John Bowles Daly, the Irish principal of Mahinda College, Galway, in Ceylon. He's wearing this wonderful Nehru suit and fantastic moustaches. And Mahinda College is a Buddhist Theosophical Society English-speaking secondary school. And Daly talks about his view of Ireland and how it informs his understanding of what people need in Ceylon. They need a technical, not a literary education. Just as at home, Ireland, young men rush into government offices for small pay, and the nobler arts are deserted for a literary education, which presents too few outlets for talent. In that respect, Daly shares a view with Augusta Gregory's husband, Sir William Gregory, who, after being involved in the National Museum in Ireland, was involved in setting up the National Museum in Colombo, with very much the same sort of view, that the point was to gather the artistic and craft wealth of the world and of different historical periods in order to stimulate artisan and craft and design work in Ireland. So those equivalences were not exclusive to religion, but that's what religion is my main focus here. On the left is the rather wonderful Vivian Butler Burke, who founded Ireland's first Buddhist centre in the late 1920s, talking about the help and inspiration that came to her from the shining ones of Ireland, our she or devas. I have more than once felt waves of Buddhism in the air here, enveloping me with its spirit. Buddhism and the fairy faith are one and the same. Or on the right, Irish theosophist James Cousins, talking about, apologies, I just need to move this. Men and women slowly pass with God and Mary to you to early mass by fuchsia hedges in a Kerry lane. But now, by other paths on the same quest he goes, not to the rainy peak that Patrick trod, but hearing in strange speech the name of God among the selvage of Himalayan snows. Wonderful stuff. Bad poetry, but wonderful thinking. So here, Irish and Asian religion simply equated. Here, though, something a little bit more complex. So Killiney-born Maurice Collis back in Burma, looking at a holy shrine, wonders what the older gods, I think he means Hindu deities, are doing there. And says, well, I think the monks must have believed that they would grant, these deities would grant them benefits which could not be demanded of the Buddha, just as you might ask Venus for what it might be improper to mention to the Virgin. So this is a very European model, and of course a specifically Irish model of the ancient pagan deities and then Christianity or Buddhism layered on top of that. Lafcadio Hearn, by contrast, on the right, simply wants to get free of Irish religion and actually sees Buddhism as a way of doing that. This is talking about his own son, saying he won't have to go to church and listen to stupid sermons and be perpetually tormented by absurd conventions. Lucky lad. So these equivalences are made in all sorts of ways and in both directions. This wonderful character on the left, Captain Charles Fownes, here dressed up to help the first Asian military victory over a European power, as it was presented at the time, the Russo-Japanese War, had many decades previously been an interpreter for one of Japan's many missions to Europe, in which, after Commodore Perry and the Meiji, they had tried to work out what was the distinction between this thing called church and this thing called state, and how did it work in Europe, and what should we do at home? On the right, this wonderful cover from some Burmese ex-communists translating people like Daniel Breen, My Fight for Irish Freedom, in the late 1930s, because by the late 1930s, of course, Ireland has become independent from the British Empire, and suddenly there is a different kind of analogy that might be drawn. Okay, so let's come back to Dhammaloka and to Burma and to another sort of relationship between Ireland and Buddhism and Asia. Here's the Shwedagon Pagoda, today inside Yangon, Rangoon. Burmese Buddhism's holiest site, to such an extent that the British military, who are camped next door, have their artillery park there, are said to have guns pointed at it, with the implicit threat that if you guys kick off, we can just blow up your pagoda. And the implication that that sort of threat would be effective. Now, in 1901, 10 years before his sedition trial, he makes his name by an act of, in effect, non-violent direct action here. Because on the full moon festival in March, the pagoda is thronged as you see it here. There are stalls, there are European tourists, there are Buddhist monks, there are devout Burmese, and so on and so forth. And Dhammaloka, in his robes and bare feet, steps out and stops an off-duty police officer who wants to come onto the pagoda wearing his shoes. Says you have to take them off. And this is an absolutely dramatic moment. Why? So you probably know in much of Asia, shoes are really dirty things. You don't wear them into people's houses. You certainly don't wear them into people's religious spaces. It is, as Dhammaloka is supposed to have said, trampling on their religion. But conversely, in 1901, at this height of imperialism, Europeans are working very, very hard to separate themselves from natives, notably in clothing, to take their shoes off, to not trample on their religion, would be to lower themselves to the level of the natives, to demean themselves. So this colour line, which of course Dhammaloka has crossed in the opposite direction, that has to do with clothes, that has to do with appropriate behaviour, not, for example, begging, as Buddhist monks do, with drawing, creating clear blue water between Europeans and natives, quote unquote, and of course, avoiding what Dhammaloka engages in, subordination to an Asian religious hierarchy. Here's a contemporary observer watching a European get ordained as a Buddhist monk. It was indeed a strange sight to behold a European bowing down to a graven image, and a thrill of astonishment passed through the Europeans present, who had never dreamed such a thing possible. So here's another contradiction. On the one hand, European race privilege, on the other hand, the offensive nature of shoes on pagodas, and the fact that the policeman is off duty is quite central to this, because different rules apply to policemen on duty. Dhammaloka puts his finger right on that nervous point, or rather he puts his feet, his bare feet, straight on it, and in so doing launches what becomes one of the key issues for Burmese anti-colonialism for decades. 30 years later, Maurice Collis, who we've already met, is given special permission as senior magistrate to wear his shoes onto the pagoda. He still can't imagine taking them off, even though he is very much fraternizing with the Burmese, as his detractors put it. And he feels rude, uncomfortable, like an outsider, or worse, like an oppressor who was taking advantage of his office. And in fact, by that point, the battle was largely won. On the right, you can see Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton in their bare feet on the Shwedagon. So there's the shoes. But let me just pause for a sec on the Irish Buddhistness as well. Why is Dhammaloka particularly worrying? So here's Kim, who is another Irish Buddhist, in Kipling's best-selling book, also of 1901. Kim's heart is torn between the spy masters of the British Raj and his Tibetan Buddhist guru. Why is this worrying? Well, Kim's father is or dead father, he's an orphan, was a retired Irish military man, a retired sergeant who had married an Indian woman. And a very large chunk of the British military in Asia was Irish. And the Irish, of course, by 1901, are not famous for being particularly loyal back home. What happens if they cease to be loyal in Asia, in the space between, in effect, the Indian Mutiny and the Connaught Rangers Mutiny? Conversely, as you've seen with that map of Dhammaloka's travels and organizing, Buddhism connects up much of the colonized Asian world, much of the British Empire. It's believed, as Molly Bloom says, to have more people in it than Christianity. This isn't entirely accurate, but it's certainly known to be older than Christianity. So this thought, this background thought, what if the Irish and the Buddhists get together? Where does that leave our empire in Asia? That's rather a worrying one. So all these sorts of relationships, all these sorts of attempting to understand each other, attempting to understand colonized worlds, either from the point of view of ruling them, or in Dhammaloka's case, from the point of view of constructing anti-colonial solidarity. We have to try and understand each other through specific frames of reference. And in the high imperial period, these are the frames of reference, and of course, religion itself as a key moment. So I want to finish very, very briefly now by asking, where does this leave us today as Irish-based scholars of Asia? So in the academic study of religion, a lot of what we do at the moment is using religion, this very colonial category, or as it was constructed in the colonial and post-colonial period, to understand these kinds of relationships, not only for Buddhism, but for Islam, for Sikhism, for Baha'i, and a little plug there for the Journal for the Irish Society for the Academic Study of Religion, which is open access and free. But what we're doing there is leveraging that particular historical construction of religion and this empire of analogies, these forms of dissident Orientalism or critique of Orientalism, to look at the ways in which people knew each other, knew themselves, knew the people they were ruled by, knew the people they ruled. Constructs, for this high imperial period, all sorts of challenges, many of them familiar to this audience, I'm sure. So very late in the day, we discovered that, like Moliere's figure, we were carrying out prosopography. I'm sorry, I still can't pronounce it, but it's a fantastic word, meaning comparative biographies, because for this period, the work involved to reconstruct the biography of somebody like Dhammaloka or these other figures who we've briefly alluded to, takes an awful lot of work. So you're left with individuals who you try to put beside one another, and then you notice that, for example, whether they are pro-imperial or anti-imperial, they are still using these kinds of relationships to make sense of what they see. They are still seeing Asia through Irish eyes. We can use digital humanities to cast a much wider net than was possible 20 years ago. So we can search, for example, for Irish Buddhist, and we find ourselves with a wealth of possibilities. On the very surface, because what we are looking at usually is digitalized colonial newspapers from the capital cities, in English. And then we have to dig down into archives, as you always did. But that wide net means that you then have to look into not just one country, but multiple countries. You've got to overcome multiple linguistic and cultural challenges in a period characterized by orthographic reforms, so that for many countries, today's readers are not able to read the newspapers of the late 19th century with any ease, and rapid change, so that the same institutions are no longer, don't mean the same thing. So this has to be very collaborative research, inevitably. But the widest challenge, I suppose, is that there is not one single history. It's not that you can extend that history into today or back into the past, but that each time the relationships that connect Ireland and Asia change, so too do the ways in which we know each other, including scholarly ways. So to finish with Asian studies, we have to hope that now, as knowledge of Asia in Ireland is slowly regaining strength, that we are moving beyond Orientalisms, even beyond critical and dissident Orientalisms, that we are able to draw fully on the strength of post-colonial and decolonizing impulses. And as Mary's indicated, that we can face down the new instrumentalism, which just wants to see that knowledge as how can we get bums on seats. But it does pose us with some challenges in reflecting on what our knowledge actually is, what it's for, who it's for, and how we can carry it out in the 2020s. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Laurence, for that most stimulating talk, which really was so rich in terms of the connections that it highlighted, but also that it suggested. I think that there are probably lots of questions, and I'd just like to invite people to, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see on the extreme right-hand side a button marked Q&A, and that's the one to use if you'd like to ask a question. And that will be picked up by me, and I'll be able to ask Laurence the question on your behalf. Now, I'm just reading, there's one in already. And the question from Jacob Eisenberg is, so what Jacob is saying is that that Laurence wonderfully brought to life Dhammaloka. And then he goes on to say, what I am trying to assess is whether, is what impact Dhammaloka had beyond his personal actions or protest. And then one aspect that Jacob is wondering about is, given that often Buddhist monks were not actively involved in politics, how was his political activity taken or accepted by his peers, especially the senior monks, which I think is a very interesting question. Thank you for it, Jacob. So Laurence, perhaps you'd like to answer that.
Well, thanks for that. That's a very multi-layered question. I think the short answer is, and I have very much skimmed over the surface, but in effect, wherever he appears, he is the front man for different Asian networks. He is being used very willingly, but he's playing different roles that make sense for his Asian sponsors in Singapore, in Bangkok, in Sri Lanka, and in Burma. And in Burma, his ordination involves some of the most senior monks of the Sangha. And it seems fairly clear that part of what they are doing is they are looking for a polemicist, somebody who can go out and do this kind of thing on their behalf, perhaps also somebody that they can easily disavow if he turns out to be more trouble than he's worth, but they never do. And this is the period in Burma, as in Sri Lanka in particular, which does see the rise of the political monk. So it's a role that's being developed as Asian Buddhists ask themselves, well, what does Buddhism mean in this new century? And what should monks and laity do, with different answers in those two countries? In terms of his legacy, I want to say that in many ways, we're seeing in Asia, as in Ireland, a period of lost futures. So Dhammaloka's world, you can see, it's a very multi-ethnic challenge to colonialism, and indeed a multi-religious one. It's not yet the point that Burmese Buddhism reaches later of being a sort of ethno-nationalist supremacism, which has no space for Indian Muslims, has no space for odd Irish figures. And of course, that's a gesture that Irish nationalism itself increasingly goes through in the depths of the 20th century. So those more generous and open possibilities, which are not so much structured around a nation, a state for a nation defined by ethnicity and religion, but rather a rejection of colonialism and an openness to what comes next. Those possibilities are lost. In fact, of course, the period that is opened by Irish independence, among other things.
Thank you, Laurence, for that response. I see there are quite a few questions coming in now, but I'm just going to take them in order. There's a question here from Mary Bush, and it's, what caused the decrease in understanding of culture between Asia and Ireland?
Okay, that's easy. Ireland left the British Empire, broadly speaking, because when you compare the level of knowledge involved in, for example, the Indian civil service to the training that Irish missionaries got, it's chalk and cheese. Irish Catholic missionaries were fundamentally not sent out with any particular desire to understand the countries they were in. It was not part of their training. I go into that in some detail in Buddhism in Ireland. Whereas the Indian civil service was all about rule. So the level of knowledge was higher, but also the simple level of personal contact. So Ireland was exporting vast numbers of people as soldiers in particular, sailors, and so on. And they were also coming back. Our universities like Trinity were full of people who had been in the Indian Civil Service, in the British Army in India, and so on. All of that faded, extremely understandably, and so on. But then the Devs Ireland did not really particularly want to know about these places, except insofar as they were full of heathen idolaters who needed to be saved. And the level of knowledge that was involved by the 1950s is, quite frankly, embarrassing, even by comparison with Joyce's day.
Thanks very much, Laurence. There are quite a few questions here. I've just seen one thing that you, what now did I just see? It's this is a question from Anthony in South Africa, I think. So the question: how does W.B. Yeats fit into this Irish Buddhist / Hindu framework? How does Yeats fit into this space between empire and independence? Yeats is such an odd figure. Anthony can't quite figure him out. Please help.
Oh. In 3 lines. So the Irish theosophists, for reasons that we can't go into here, are not particularly interested in Buddhism. They're much more interested in Hinduism, unlike both British and American theosophists. But Yeats's involvement in what Joseph Lennon calls Irish Orientalism, and in dialogues with people like D.T. Suzuki, Rabindranath Tagore, and so on, is absolutely fundamental. Lafcadio Hearn, as you know, but also Maurice Collis. You keep on hearing these echoes of, I think Yeats said at one point, had the Irish peasantry not been in Asia until the Battle of the Boyne. This sense that somehow there is an ancient way of being that is shared between Asia and Ireland, which you see in those reflections on the fairy faith being the same as Indian devas or Burmese nats or whatever. And the recovery of what we would now call folk culture or folk religion as against high religion, the sense that this is the really interesting thing in Irish peasant culture, as in, for example, Lafcadio Hearn's interest in Japanese ghost stories, not the only side of Hearn by any means, as you know well, but Yeats helps to create that bridge in which these kinds of romantic conversations can happen in opposition, not necessarily to empire, but certainly to modernity and a sort of top-down Christianity. He's a very key mediating figure there, yes.
So there's another question here. Like Anthony, Paul Murray is a Lafcadio Hearn specialist. And Paul has a question. Has Laurence investigated the views of the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Home Rulers, on the issue of empire, of the empire?
Short answer, no. But I suppose what I would say is there is, in this discussion of imperial analogies, there is a whole other discourse, which I'm sure you're fully familiar with, on how Irish nationalism and Asian nationalism thought of each other. So we're discussing at the moment, of course, those Irish nationalists who are avid supporters of slavery versus those who are abolitionists. Those who felt very strongly that Irish home rule and Asian home rule, or indeed independence, should go hand in hand, and those who clung to a sense of being white. And Maurice Collis is a wonderful figure in this respect, because when Burma is seeking home rule in 1931, there's a break. They're over in London, and there's a Christmas break, and he invites them over to Ireland to meet people from both sides of the treaty debate. So he brings them to meet A, who waffles at them about Hinduism and leaves them baffled, Robert Barton, who had signed the treaty, and Maud Gonne from the other side. And Maud Gonne says rather wonderfully, her advice to them is, if you're dealing with the British, get it all in writing. Which is advice that might have been remembered well during the Brexit discussions. So those analogies are very definitely made at the political level and indeed in physical force nationalism in Ireland and India. Kate O'Malley has worked on that.
So I see another question here from Ruben Flores, and it's, of course, everybody is thanking you for the wonderful talk, but I'm just giving the questions. How much is known about why and how Dhammaloka was forgotten?
So the shoe controversy is still taught in Burmese schools. It's a key part of today's Burmese national narrative. But it doesn't have any place for an Irish ex-hobo and his motley crew of Indian Muslim associates. For much the same reason, of course, that Devs Ireland did not want to know anything about an Irish person turned Buddhist who was a key figure in Burma. That didn't fit the narrative. And you can illustrate that by coming back to Pranjivan Mehta, who's a very, very central figure. So Gandhi's book, Hind Swaraj, which launches the idea of boycott, is written for Mehta, right? Mehta's United Burma, this seditious rag that supports Dhammaloka, is archived neither in the Pandit Nehru Library of the Indian national struggle, nor in any Burmese library, because an Indian INC, Congress radical in Burma, like Dhammaloka, doesn't fit the retrospective origin narratives that subsequent nation states have constructed for themselves. So he, like Dhammaloka and that wider multi-ethnic world that you can see there on the seafront in Rangoon, the riverfront, sorry, they get forgotten. They don't suit us. And now, of course, you know, maybe they become a bit more interesting.
Laurence, can I just, we've got a little bit, we've got about 3 minutes, I think, left. And could I just, I don't think there's another question in, although maybe there is. I was going to ask you 2 very quick questions. Actually,
go ahead. Just
hold on a second, because I see there is one here. I just, this is just a question from Micah Nguyen, and it's, thank you so much for bringing out the many complexities of Irish-Asian relations in the wider frame of colonialism. In your talk, you've described Dhammaloka as a hobo, a sailor, washed up, and I wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more about these types as pivotal individuals in the wider colonial space. I suppose, were there many of them?
Well, there were quite a lot of these beachcomber bhikkhus, so bhikkhu being Buddhist monk, for a fairly straightforward reason, which is if you were in the Indian civil service or you were Colonel Sir Charles Fitzgerald, after your 20 years in India, you went home. You married a nice English or Irish gal, you settled down. You maybe started teaching languages in Trinity. But empire depended on all these sailors and soldiers and railwaymen and bizarre categories like horse grooms. They didn't get to go home. They stayed, they settled down, they started families, they went native. Often probably they went along to the local temple, and they were a source of deep anxiety. So by the turn of the 20th century, about half the European population in India is these poor whites who are not behaving like gentlemen and keeping their distance from the natives. And in the period after the Great Indian Rebellion, these are a source of deep anxiety. So the workhouses, fingerprinting, mugshots and so on are forever trying to work out who these people are. They worry them a lot.
Thank you, Laurence. Laurence, I think you have really given us most generously of your time. So I don't want to sort of shoot in a whole lot of questions at the end, but I do think I would just like to read out one last question that I see here. You won't have time to answer it, but I think it would be interesting for people to hear it. And I'm still going to put my 2 questions after that. So this question is from Cahill Brua, Cahill McSweeney Brua. There are parallels with Charles Fear Andrews, and English clergyman who became an English clergyman who became Gandhi's secretary and advisor. And the question is, would they have known each other? So that's a very interesting question. The question I had was, well, there were 2 questions. You know, what do you think radicalized this man? You know, what was the thing, or was there a thing that really radicalized him? And then I'd love to know more about, this is my own ignorance, but I presume I'll be able to somehow find answers to the question, what did he know other languages? And if so, what other languages did he know, Dhammaloka? Now there is one last question that I see here, which is very simple, very easy to answer, but I'm going to need perhaps one of the back room colleagues to respond to this, perhaps, because I don't know otherwise, because I don't know the answer to the question. It's, when will the recording of this talk be made available? I think it will eventually be put up, that is for sure, on the Asia Pacific Research Network website, which at the moment is still on, in the scaffolding is still up. We haven't actually gone live with that website yet, but I can tell you for absolutely sure and certain.
They're saying in the chat.
What's that? There is an answer.
They're saying by Monday.
By Monday, okay. Well, that's the quick answer. So we've only gone 1 minute over time, but I just want to thank Laurence for the wonderful talk. I'd like to thank Hugo and Now again for supporting the organization. And I'd most of all like to thank everybody who gave up their time to ask questions, gave up their time to listen. And I'd really like to wish you all a very peaceful evening. And I think we're all thinking of Myanmar at this time. Goodbye, everybody.